This is Simon Morley, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, we're live from John Leon Guerrero's house in the new Bayside studio. And we've got Simon on the show. And I guess Simon's written a really cool book. Let me put the link up here so you guys can all see that. But it's called By Any Other Name, The Cultural History of the Rose. I'm fascinated by roses, Simon. I'm an Intel guy by trade. And in the U.S. Army military crest for the Intel branch, there's a rose because it connotes meaning that works for us. In our case, it's like deceit. You know, the rose can mean that. But I want to start this conversation going further back than me being in the Army. And I want to go back. So Timothy McIntosh Smith is a British guy who lives abroad. Actually, I think he lives in the Far East now. But he wrote a 3,000-year history of the Arabs. And it's a big, thick, fat book. And one of the things he talks about in there, among many, many, many things, is roses. And they appear pretty early in the story. So, I mean, you think about 3,000 years back, and that's how far back Arabs go. And someone way back when figured out that they could cultivate and domesticate roses, and we're off to the races. So let's just kind of start as far back as we can.
Well, that's right. I think as a Brit, I find the British often think they own the rose, that it sort of miraculously appeared in England at some point. Mm-hmm. And of course, it is closely associated with Englishness, English history. But yeah, as you say, the Arabs were interested in roses. Or let's not just say the Arabs, but the kind of the area of the Fertile Triangle. If we go a little bit further back, mm-hmm. Very early civilizations in that area, which is now Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, North Africa, that kind of area was an area where they first started cultivating roses. I mean, there were species roses in that region, but they started cultivating them for various reasons. One was because they created a rose water, which was a kind of scented water that was useful as a disinfectant, as a way of removing nasty smells. It's still used quite a lot in Arab countries, rose water. So the rose had a practical purpose as well as being beautiful. And the other place, though, we need to start when we're talking about roses is China. Mm. Now, China has the most species roses of anywhere in the world. Hmm. And so you can talk about these two origins of the rose, essentially. One is the Fertile Triangle, the Middle East, or whatever you want to call it, the Near East. Mm-hmm. And the other is China. And there's a land link between those two places. So there was also down the various trade routes, there was trading of roses. So some of the characteristics of Chinese roses got transported and traded to the Fertile Triangle in the Middle East. And then much later, with the Greeks, they started moving further west into Europe. And then the Romans adopted them from the Greeks. And that's when they began to become more than just some useful and beautiful flower, but also took on a very rich symbolism.
The symbolism part is interesting too, because culturally, and this is part of what your book does, it looks at the different cultural importance of the rose across many places. It means a lot of different things. Again, back to the Intel thing for me, and it being a sign of deceit or deception. What other kind of symbolisms come out of, say, China, where the rose was happening before it was happening anywhere else?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And actually, what's surprising is that the rose has very little symbolic meaning for the Chinese. And I've been trying to work out why this should be, insofar as they have a very rich culture of flowers, and there are lots of flower painting. But they prefer, for example, the peony to the rose. And the peony has some of the connotations that we consider to be symbolic of the rose. For example, female beauty. I mean, there are references in Chinese poetry to comparing a young woman to a rose and so on. But it's very surprising that the very multi-layered symbolism of the rose that we have in the West doesn't exist in China at all. So that leads to a question: why is that?
Exactly.
And I can't answer that question. I'm still trying to answer it. I mean, I live in the Republic of Korea, so I'm right here in the Far East, and I've been talking to Koreans because it's the same in Korean culture. They have lots of species roses, but no symbolic, historical valuation of the rose. Same in Japan. So it's a very interesting cultural difference.
What about the gifting of a rose? I mean, it depends on this, like Valentine's Day is the time when you give roses, but there's also cultures that use roses to connote death, or colors, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a rose. But what about that? Does that change around quite a bit, or is that mostly a Western thing?
Well, nowadays it's an Eastern thing too, but that's largely because of Westernization, modernization. So, for example, let's talk about Valentine's Day, right? This is one of the moments when people give roses, normally red roses, spend a huge amount of money on roses, cut roses, and on rose-themed merchandise, including lingerie and so on and so forth, rose-flavored chocolates and whatever. Now the Chinese do that, and the Koreans do that, and the Japanese do that. But obviously, Valentine's Day is a Western invention, basically one of pretty much of the 19th century, and it's been imported like so much else from the West to the East. But why was the rose associated with Valentine's Day? So that starts to get us looking further back in time, and it's quite an interesting story, because the rose was associated in classical culture, by which I mean the Greeks and the Romans, with Venus, right, goddess of love.
Right.
That's one of the most important traditional symbolic meanings of the rose in the West. The rose was one of Venus's associates, if you like, attributes. Why is that? We then need to ask, don't we? Why was the rose particularly, not just the rose, there are actually quite a few flowers, plants, animals that are associated with the goddess of love, but especially the rose. And perhaps the answer to that is that the rose turns out to be a very powerful symbol of love, because it's beautiful, aromatic, but also it has the prickles, the thorns, which means, as we all know, that love is not, I was just about to say a bed of roses. That's slightly, it is a bed of roses, but the roses have thorns. So it became a way of talking about that ambiguous and aspect of and power of love. We can be pricked by love. So that's where that began. Now, of course, it's a multi-million-dollar industry, cultivating roses to give as gifts, and not just Valentine's Day, right? Your mum's birthday, you give roses, probably.
Right.
Girlfriend, your wife's birthday, rose. And yes, as you mentioned, death. Death is also a time to give roses. Perhaps not bright pink aromatic roses, which are more erotic, but a more somber kind of rose, perhaps, with a name suitable to the occasion too, because roses tend to get given names that somehow will connect with an event. So why are roses associated with death? You got any theory about that? Why do you think we give roses when people die?
Here's my guess. Because when people die, you don't know what to do. And so you're like, well, let's just get them something that will brighten up their life for a little bit as we get through this time of grieving. So I'm going to guess it's just a mechanism for doing something nice for somebody to provide some sunshine during a dark time. Yeah,
that sounds like a very reasonable explanation. I mean, flowers have often been used to memorialize the dead, not just roses, any old flower. And yes, they're beautiful, and they cheer us up. They make us think of positive things. But also, as poets have often noted, the rose has is quite, or any flower, but the rose particularly is also a useful symbol in terms of the meaning of death, because of course the flower will blossom briefly, wilt and die.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a way of remembering our destiny too. And it's interesting, isn't it, that nowadays very often you go to a graveyard or a funeral and they're plastic flowers. People lay plastic flowers on graves. I mean, here they do it.
Right.
In America, everywhere they do it, which I've got a plastic rose behind me actually in the vase.
Oh, look at that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Plastic roses. Well, of course, they look vaguely, if you don't look closely, they're like real roses. But of course, they do one thing. They don't do the one thing that makes a rose so poignant, which is dye.
Right.
They're there forever. Well, and they get a bit grimy and
dusty.
Yeah, dusty. But basically, they kind of fake the effect, but only on a very superficial level. And in the book, I sort of reflect on that idea, and I wonder whether the fact that we've so easily just taken to using plastic roses, imitations, is somehow a reflection of the fact that we're losing touch with the meaning of death. We're putting it away from our daily life, and using a plastic rose is obviously a very superficial token compared to using real flowers.
I wonder, because this is something, so my brother just passed away, and not even a month ago, and so obviously this is a time for me of mourning and everything. But as I've done this and I've kind of gone through the memories, I looked at some of our family history, and death was normal. Every 2-3 years, someone in the family was dying, whether they were young or old. And I think we've gotten pretty far from that nowadays, since people reliably live to 70, 80 years old. Someone who dies in their 70s, we say, oh, it's too young, like they had time left. Maybe we're just not as good at people passing away as we used to be. And it's sort of like, this is how we do it. Like, let's just get these flowers and we'll give them out, and maybe you can give them to somebody else and re-gift them or something. I don't know.
No, I think that's absolutely right, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, it is astonishing. And you look back in history at the level of infant mortality, for example. Up to 1/3 of children died before the age of 15.
Yeah.
So right into the 19th century in Europe, even in Western Europe. So, yeah, we've got very skillful at delaying that moment, but also as a result, we've lost touch with the experience of it, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Like so much else, I mean, we're using this wonderful invention, the internet, to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And it seems kind of real.
But it's a bit of a plastic rose.
Yeah, it is. It's plastic rose. I mean, it's real enough to kind of satisfy, just a bit like a plastic rose is real enough to kind of satisfy. But obviously, we're aware that there's something missing, right? There's something missing. But we're getting more and more used to that experience, limiting ourselves to that level of experience.
Well, maybe some of these things, like I think about the different varieties of roses that they make now. Like Queen Elizabeth has her own rose, right? Because that's appropriate, because she's, the ultimate English rose. But there are so many different, I think there's a Lady Diana rose, and there's all these different roses that are assigned, created. There's a market for that, where you have red tips on a white rose, or, whatever it's going to be. We can make these roses with incredible rapidity, like if we can just do it over and over again, so you can make a market for, oh yes, well, the rose that I love is the whatever it's going to be, pick a new rose. So there's some benefit with the modernity and the ability to create exactly what you want in the world of roses.
Oh yes, we've become very, very skillful at breeding roses to suit a market. And again, that's a modern story. It dates really from the 19th century. I mean, I imagine walking around London with William Shakespeare, who's quite famous for talking about roses. And we look at the roses in people's gardens in the streets of London, And I'm imagining him thinking, "Begads, 'tis not a rose," or whatever, however he would, you know, he would not believe that the roses that we call, the plant that we call a rose is a rose,
Right.
because they're basically modern hybrids.
Hmm.
They're bred roses. Of course, we still have many of the roses that Shakespeare knew, like damask rose is a famous one. Gallica roses. These are all ancient roses that the Greeks and the Romans and the Arabs, would have known. The damask, in fact, comes originally from that region.
Sure.
But most of the roses we grow in our gardens that we enjoy are modern. And what's particularly interesting, I mean, for me, because of where I live, Korea, is that these modern roses are essentially marriages between Chinese roses and Western roses, by which I mean Middle Eastern and West European roses. Now, why did the breeders, starting in the 19th century, early 20th century, want to cross Chinese roses and Western roses?
Yeah.
Well, because the Chinese roses have one very special feature that's missing in practically all the roses in the other side of the world, the West. And that is that they flower repeatedly over a long period of time. Now, we take that for granted, right? I mean, in my garden here in Korea now, there's a rose that's still blooming. I mean, it's getting very cold here in the evening. Well, you're in California, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have that problem. So your roses, you're used to roses blooming
all the time. Yeah,
all the time. That's thanks to Chinese rose parent. It's because the Chinese roses evolved to, not all of them, but many of them evolved to repeat flower. And when the Western botanists and rose breeders, flower breeders discovered that in the 18th century, basically, they were very hungry to get hold of these Chinese roses and tried to cross them with the ones that they knew back home. And at first they weren't very successful because they didn't understand how it worked breeding plants. You know, it was a kind of only with the discovery of how to cross different kinds of plants in the 19th century that how heredity worked, that they managed to turn it into a kind of science. And after that, boom, there was the development of whole new families of roses. Two main ones. One's called hybrid tea. Hybrid tea. Why is it called tea?
I don't know.
Well, because Chinese roses, family of Chinese roses, are called tea roses. Why are they called tea roses? Well, there's a question mark about that. Do they smell a little bit like some kinds of Chinese tea? The scent, maybe. Another theory is that they were often sent west on the same ships that were trading tea from China. So they became associated with tea from China, tea rose. Anyway, those hybrid teas they look more like the Chinese roses. That's the other thing, that Western roses tended to either just have 5 petals and open wide with stamens in the middle, or they had very many petals and were packed quite densely, closely together. But most of the Chinese roses had less petals, and they took more of a cup form. So the plastic rose you can see behind me is a typical hybrid tea rose, and the form of that rose is coming from Chinese parent. Then after the hybrid teas became really successful, another family was created called the floribundas, which, as the name suggests, had bloomed, but many flowers all together blooming, panicles as it's called. So that's another kind of rose we now see everywhere, but didn't exist in Shakespeare's time. So as you can see, we're living with an ancient flower that's actually also a brand new flower.
Interesting. When you look at these histories and the cultural impact on things, I mean, this seems like it's etymology. You're trying to dig back to find the beginning of a certain kind of rose, or, what a certain rose did to change the impact, and, what was there before the Damascus rose was created, or was that it, and how do you dig? I mean, do you approach it like that, or how do you approach this understanding of the history of it? Because it goes back, I mean, it sounds like as far back as humans were here and had the time and the inclination to give someone a flower. It sounds like roses were an early pick.
Yeah, they were, and also they were chosen for a reason that perhaps we forget, which is that they had a beautiful scent. And Shakespeare would have been a bit disappointed if he'd leant over to smell the roses in a modern London garden. Very few of them have a powerful scent, because that's one thing that often got lost as the breeders got to work to develop the modern rose. A lot of modern roses have no scent. They might look beautiful, but they have no scent.
Right.
But yes, the origins of the word rose is rhodon, which is the Greek. And the origin of that word, they're not quite sure about, but they think they track back to the Fertile Triangle and to the languages of that region. So you can see how the word also tells a story of a journey in which the rose was traded across geographical regions. And obviously in China, there's a whole other etymology. Meigui is the Chinese word for a rose, and that's completely not associated with our word for rose. So yeah, it's interesting to think about that, and I do talk about where does our word rose come from. There's another interesting point is that in English we say rose for the plant, right, the flower. But we normally, if you asked what color is that rose behind me, that plastic rose behind me, you wouldn't say rose color, would you? You'd say pink.
No, pink. Pink.
Yeah, and that's Shakespeare wouldn't have said pink because the word wasn't really used back then. It's surprisingly
right.
It's a relatively new introduction to the English language.
But if you do say something as rose colored, you do think of a pinkish rose colored lenses. So,
seeing the world through rose tinted glasses. We still use the word rose, but if you're French, say, or in most other languages, the word for the plant and the word for the color is exactly the same, rose. So there's a much closer correlation between a plant and a color in some languages than there is now in English. So for example, when Edith Piaf sings La Vie en Rose, or my favorite version of that is Grace Jones's disco bossa nova version. I don't know if you know it. It's a wonderful video of her singing.
I love Grace Jones.
Check it out on YouTube. Grace Jones singing La Vie en Rose, bossa nova style.
Oh, that's so great.
With, guess what, a rose in her hair. Edith Piaf sings La Vie en Rose. So for us, we translate that as literally we'd translate it as the life in rose color, right? Or the life through rose tinted glasses, maybe. Right. But in French,
that's funny.
You wouldn't lose so much the association too with the idea of the flower, because we'd be saying La Vie en Rose would also mean not just the color, but the flower too would be more brought to mind.
I have to mention Malcolm Joseph because he plays bass for Grace Jones and he's been on the show several times. So and he's English. Since we're in the musical realm too, you think about Paul Weller writes a song, The English Rose, and it's just this classic song from the Jam, but it just applies to this mean, you wouldn't call it a meme because it's not meme in the modern sense, but it is like a meme in the classical sense, where like the English rose, like, oh, there's a girl, a classic English rose, and you sort of know what that looks like without ever even seeing the girl.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, as you say, a meme. It is a true. There are rose memes out there, very successful rose memes, aren't they? Particularly, since the rose meme got sort of transferred wherever the Westerners went, we took that rose meme with us.
Right.
So now the Koreans would probably say, would know what we mean when we say she looks like an English rose.
Right.
And yes, that's another reason, I suppose, why we English think we own the rose. That it's somehow miraculously, perhaps just first grew in England. Yeah, I think that's probably what we think. First the English first grew, roses in England, and then we shared them with the world, or something like that. That's what the English think.
And is there any kind of history? And I'm just kind of banging around topics here, but I'm curious. The etymology stuff always interests me. So words like Rhodesia and obviously Rhode Island, where we have it, the Isle of Rhodes in Greece. Are these places that are known for having, like, how does Rhodes become Rhodes if not for having a lot of roses on it?
Well, bang on, right? Exactly. It's probably true that the name of the island came from the fact that it was a place where roses were cultivated.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And it would have been mostly either damask or Gallica roses. And damask, you called it the Damascus rose, and that's right. That's another name for it. Why is damask rose called the Damascus rose? Because that was a region that was famous in the classical world for cultivating roses. Now, cultivating roses was a cash crop, mostly for this rose water, okay? But also because roses were given at special occasions, like we did. They were given at parties, dinners. They were, remember, people didn't bathe so much back then.
Mm-hmm.
It was a smelly world back then. And scented roses were quite helpful to, improve the air where you were. Right. So they had that practical function. So roses was big business way back. It's one of the oldest. If you think about cultivation of crops for eating, like wheat, rye, rice over here. But roses also were used for practical reasons, or cultivated for practical reasons, not just because they're pretty, which is mostly what we think of the rose now, don't we? We think that they're pretty, but that wasn't what was so important, or the main importance back then.
The one time where I'm suspect of roses as a thing is on the Great British Baking Show, or whatever you guys call that show there, with Paul Hollywood and Prue and all those folks. Whenever they use rose water as an ingredient, I'm like, oh, bad choice, because it never seems to pull off. But it's just funny how otherwise there's just really no negative connotation. It's like the ultimate gift, right? If you're going to do something nice for someone, you can give them a rose, and it's just, there's no hating it. It's just universally sort of loved.
You're right. But of course, that might be the reason for hating it now.
Of course.
Especially for us intellectuals, we might just say it's a goddamn cliche, empty of meaning. That
fair enough.
In fact, there's a movie I talk about, which I'm sure American Beauty. From about 1998 or something.
Something like that. 1999.
And roses are very strongly present in that movie. I don't know if you recall. When he has his erotic dreams about his daughter's friend, the cheerleader. She opens her blouse and all these roses, red roses, float out, and she imagines her bathing in a bath of petals of roses and so on. But also, those are the most memorable images of roses. But actually, if you look more closely, and I hadn't realized it at the time, but read subsequently, that roses are everywhere in that movie. People are always pruning them in their gardens, and there are bouquets of roses on the tables. And
yeah, I hadn't noticed that. That's funny.
yeah, but in fact, it's used as a empty symbol of the emptiness of the middle class provincial American life in the movie. It's used as a sign of a kind of fake emotional life, inauthenticity. Let's say inauthenticity.
Yeah, you're right.
Including his inauthentic fantasizing about the girl, and then there's the daughter and the strange boy who does the video filming. And you remember there's the moment where he films the plastic bag floating in the air. Very beautiful moment. And of course, that's the true beauty. True beauty is that surprise and uncodified moment of admiring the way the plastic bag wafts around in the air. That's real beauty, and the rose is fake beauty. It's become a mere token, just like so much else in modern life. It has become like, the fact we talked about people giving plastic roses at funerals, or putting graves. It's all kind of empty signifiers, empty meanings, just surface. So you could argue, but I don't, but you could argue that the rose has, become this tired old symbol, sentimental cliche, right?
Yeah. Of course, it's been around for so long, it's likely to make a comeback as well, too. Or do you think these things move inexorably towards, that reminds me of grandma, doesn't remind me of today?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, yes, of course, there is the danger when something's been around for a long time that it becomes sort of so familiar that it no longer does anything, means anything. It really, but on the other hand, that can work the other way around. Something that's been around for a very long time must have some deep, let's be Jungian, archetypal value, continuing value. It's just that perhaps it's sort of got a bit buried under all the superficial meanings. And so, one of the things I try to say in my book is that, so the rose has become a cliche. It's everywhere and nowhere, in a way. And yet there's still evidence of how it can be used to say something very important. Poets still write about roses. Artists still make art about roses.
Yeah.
People still write books about roses. In other words, it's a challenge. Perhaps that's what I'm saying. The rose. Maybe one reason why I wanted to write about roses, because I'm not a horticulturalist, a botanist. I'm not. I'm coming more from an art history background, and in my field, we're particularly conscious of the way in which so much in our cultures kind of been, kind of fake, if you like. It's a sort of it's lost its deeper meanings. It's just become like in the movie American Beauty.
Right.
And for example, it's very rare now for our artists or art historians to talk about beauty. Why don't we talk about beauty? Because we think beauty's like being colonized by money or various the feminists say, for example, let's talk about what feminists might have a problem with the rose, right? Because it's so much associated with a certain kind of idea of womanhood. You say the English rose.
Sure.
Great, we like that, right? us heterosexual men, we like to say that we don't have a problem with that.
Right.
But a feminist may well have a big problem with that, as likening a woman to a pretty flower.
Yeah.
You know, whereas us guys get to be likened to wolves, or lions, or whatever, right? Foxes. Women get likened to a pretty flower, and so they might protest against those kinds of symbolic associations. And it's true to think about them, isn't it? To question them, because obviously they might be hiding some kind of patriarchal values that need to be questioned.
Right. Or maybe it's just a way to describe something, you know, especially with the English rose. I mean, we can all draw what we think an English rose is, and there's going to be some commonality in that. Like, I think an English rose is wearing a dress. She's not wearing jeans. You know, there's a softness to it. And it is a way to describe something. It might be dated in some ways, but I don't think anyone says that to give offense, right? And so when we talk about these things, if you intend to describe, like, okay, so if I was to use the word faggot properly, right, as a bundle of sticks, that would be a problem, because we hear that word and we close up and we're like, oh no, like, but I actually mean in the traditional actual sense, you know, this is a bundle of sticks, like the Led Zeppelin album. You know, there's a guy and he's got, you know, a whole bunch of sticks on his back. What would you call that? Or you could say a whole bunch of sticks, or you could use the proper word. We lose track of that stuff, but I guess that's kind of what's happening with the rose too, from what you're saying.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, it would be interesting to do a kind of some market research, you know, say, what's the first thing that comes into your head when I say the word rose? I'd be curious to know, and it'd be even more interesting, wouldn't it, to do a cross-cultural one where you ask Chinese people what's the first thing, and, you know, American people and so on. I'm not sure how much we'd find that the data suggested everyone came up with the same idea. And yeah, I mean, that's right. Words can become sullied by certain negative associations, and then they become difficult to use, don't they? I mean, I don't think. I mean, the rose hasn't reached that point. I don't think it ever will.
I think you can also, you know, you can slide into the archaic, and then something can bring something archaic back, like the word vitriol we use here in America quite a bit, and it's like got a cultural connotation with hate. And if you look it up, you know, it used to, at least for a long time, it said this is an archaic word we don't use anymore. We say something else. Even the name rose. So in my family, in my daughter's family, this is the best way to describe it. My daughter's got 3 grandmothers named Rose, a great grandmother, and then my mom and her mom's mom are all Roses. And so these things probably go in waves. And if there was an extremely famous singer named Rose, you know, it's likely that people are going to name their kid Rose again. All of a sudden, there'll be this whole field of young people named Rose, and it just takes that cultural magnet to all of a sudden make it relevant again.
Yeah, that's right, isn't it? Yeah, actually, my grandmother was called Rose, and my sister's middle name is Rose, and her daughter's name is Rose.
Right.
And why is that? I mean, yeah, obviously, because at least certainly in my grandmother's generation, the rose had very powerful, valuable meaning in terms of womanhood. You know, it was a very positive image for women to have the name Rose, just as in Latin countries, you know, Rosa was very good. And we passed the name down through the generations to honor each generation, right? Probably like in your family. But by the time we've got to my niece, whose name is Rose, by her generation, the rose has probably not got quite the same central value and uncomplicated symbolic meaning as it had for her great grandmothers. It's changed slightly through time. It's still it's still got a positive meaning. So people will want to call their kid Rose, but I think it's far less likely now. And as you say, yeah, if the hip hop star decides to call themselves Rose something or other, then maybe the younger generation would then start using it to name their kids. But perhaps it is possibly dying out as a name for
maybe
female children.
Or maybe it's present in some other form. I know a popular name in Arabic for girls is Zahra or Zahura. That name basically means flower or flowers. And maybe that's the generic term for rose in some part of the Middle East. And it comes from there. And, if you take that Indo-European language chart and you put it all together, you realize that Zahra and rose are really the same word if you go far enough back. And I'm not saying that that's true. I'm not trying to be an etymologist, but these things happen where we've just lost the meaning for that thing and we don't realize it's there every day. Again, like when we say Rhodes Scholar, we're saying Rose Scholar. We just don't think of it that way. It's lost that connotation, and maybe Rhodesia is, a place of roses.
Well, that one it's not. That's named after Cecil Rhodes, who was the English statesman who founded the country.
Right. Okay.
But Rhodes, his name Rhodes, surely would have come possibly from rose in Greek somehow or other.
Right.
So there's there's lots of ways. Actually, the word you mentioned Arabic, and in Persian, Iranian, the word for rose is gul, and that also means flower in general.
Right. Yeah.
So that implies that in their culture, it implies first of all that like every culture in the past, there wasn't so much of this kind of classification. That's a modern, classifying everything into this and this and this and this. Things were more vaguely associated. But also it's a sign of the preeminence of the rose in their culture.
Yeah.
It was the one that came to mind first. So other flowers were named in association with it.
Right. Yeah. I bet there is a connection between Zahra and Rose. I
think there is. I can't remember exactly, but you're right. Yeah, that's and again we're going back to where we started. That the rose is if anyone's got a right to call themselves the custodian of the rose, it's going to be, I would say, the Iranians.
Okay.
Because that's where the rose has had the most intense and continuous significance. And it's the national flower of Iran.
Right.
And isn't it weird that the national flower of Iran and the national flower of the United States is the same?
Yeah.
The rose. Arch enemies, at least at the moment. They both share the rose, and for completely different reasons.
Yeah. And when you think about history and how ancient things are ancient, if we just dig 10 feet deeper, we might find out that, well, and look, we lose track of this too. Persia at one point was the same place as Babylon, and there's Persian monuments in Iraq. And so you can go back and maybe roses go back to Babylon and maybe Sumer, in Sumeria, in that area.
Oh yes, they do.
Yeah. So it's like it goes back as far as there's people, really. At that point, it's like these things have just always been there. And if it's beautiful and you see it somewhere, you're like, how can I transport this back to my family? And it's a 2-day ride. All of a sudden, this thing's traveled 50 miles and then 50 miles, and the next thing you know, it's all over the place.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And even hundreds of miles, thousands of miles along the Silk Road, for example. Roses got traded both directions, along with all the other things that were traded.
Yeah.
And that's how various different kinds of species rose, and sports, as they're called, which are chance mutations of roses, spread throughout the whole Eurasian landmass.
Oh, I love it.
And eventually, got to America too, of course. There's lots of roses in America, but a lot of the roses that Americans think are natives of your country are not.
Right.
They were brought here by Westerners.
I love thinking about this stuff because, like, I think about Rhode Island and the Isle of Rhodes. Let's say the Isle of Rhodes. How far is that as the crow flies from Damascus? It's just not that far. And then Italy is even closer, probably. So you're talking an easy day of sailing, to get to either of these locations with a rose. And then when we lose track of that, we always like the city Naples in Italy is named after, it's Neapolis. It's just their way of saying the Greek word new city, and there's all kinds of Greek monuments in Sicily, like there's a huge Grecian population and cultural value there, right? So we lose track of these things have all kind of swarmed over the top of each other. And so, roses become a common thing for everybody because everybody was everywhere, and
there you have an answer to the question: why is the rose a shared symbol for us, but not in East Asia? And that's because basically European culture is still rooted in the classical world, in the classical civilizations of the Near East and the Mediterranean and North Africa, the Greece, Rome, and also Persia, and that whole area. And Turkey, what we now call Turkey. So we are rooted in that civilization. Of course, it's become more and more attenuated over the millennia, to the extent that it's unlikely in the way. Well, let's say just 100 years ago. Well, even me. Okay, at school, I had to study Latin, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that's a clear indication of a cultural roots. Yeah.
Yeah.
But now kids won't study Latin.
No.
As a rule.
Right.
That's another an indication of the fact that the link to that history is now far weaker than it was. It's certainly in terms of the way we think about language. Perhaps someone nowadays. I notice quite a lot of Westerners want to learn Korean now.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because they love BTS and
Exactly.
K-pop. And Korean and Chinese obviously is a language to learn in the future. That's the one to learn because they are the future. But and that obviously, since we've gone global culture, everything's got much more complicated and confused in terms of our cultural heritage or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
I mean, it's strange to imagine what a Korean thinks when they give a rose, to their Korean boy gives a rose to his girlfriend, or 100 roses. What are they? That's a strange cultural hybrid thing to do, isn't it? Because it's not in their culture at all before 50 years ago.
If you walked around Korea and you looked for a businessman wearing a suit and they had a rose in their lapel, I bet you'd walk for days before you saw that.
Oh yeah, you wouldn't see that.
But you'd see it in London, though.
Yeah, probably a bit. I mean,
not a lot, but you would see it though.
Yeah, I mean, it's because the symbolism got transferred, but only to a limited extent. It got packaged. I mean, if we want to be cynical, it got packaged. It got, commercialized. Only in a particular way. So the rose got commercialized over here as the thing you give the person you love.
Right.
And that's what it's been sold to Koreans as. It doesn't have much other meaning for them.
I want to ask you about, because I'm looking at your Amazon. By the way, everybody should get by any other name, Cultural History of the Rose on Amazon. The link is there. It'll be in the show notes if you're listening on the podcast side. You've written 3 different books, and you wouldn't call these books like, oh yeah, that's an obvious moneymaker. You're writing these things from a point of passion and interest, because one of your books is a book about monochromatic art, and so when you say these things, it's like, well, that's interesting. I never thought about that. But you're studying things that fascinate you. So what was it about roses, and what was it about monochromatic art or words? The book is about words. What is it about these topics that drives you to spend this much time looking into it?
Yes. Well, okay, I'll start with roses, as that's the easiest one, probably. Well, yeah, because that's just, one reason, subliminal, is probably because the name of people in my family was Rose.
Yeah.
I think subliminally.
Okay.
I grew up with roses, as like everyone did, although I never noticed them. I never noticed them until I was well into my 30s. And I can remember the moment. I talk about it in the book. You say one of those epiphany moments. I was feeling very depressed, sorry for myself, walking home from the tube, right? We call it the tube, you call it the subway. And I noticed roses growing in the gardens on the way. And it was November. And I thought, roses in November. And of course, roses bloom in November, but I never noticed them before. I just associated them with something that happened in the springtime. Right. I never noticed any nature, basically. I lived in urban places, cities, and so on. I live in the countryside now, and so I suddenly woke up, and it cheered me up as well. It really cheered me up. And then I got really interested in roses, and I started growing them and reading about them. And then so it went on. I got more. I guess I'm a bit obsessive, maybe, about things when I got interested in them. And that's also probably why I'm interested in this monochrome painting. I make art. I am a painter, and guess what? I make kind of monochrome paintings. But I was very interested in this weird phenomenon. The more I talk to people who are not artists or not in the art world about the monochrome, the more weird I realize the whole idea is of making a painting that's sort of one color. Yeah. So I just wanted to explore that in detail. So I wrote a book about it. Yeah. And then the words one, I also do art with words. So I do monochrome words. Yeah. So guess what? I thought I'd write a book about words too. Yeah. And also because there wasn't anything out there already about it. Right. I thought I could contribute something. Obviously, that's very different with the rose. There's a huge number of books out there about roses, but they tend to be pretty picture books, don't they? Coffee table books, which is great. Yeah. But mine tries to be a bit more thoughtful. I mean, of course, there are thoughtful rose books, but thoughtful and looking at it a bit from the outside, and even with a bit more of a critical eye, because people who write about roses tend to just assume, oh, the rose is such a lovely flower, and everybody who buys my book thinks it's a lovely flower, so I'll just talk about how lovely it is. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it is lovely, but also, as we've just been saying, it's got lots of other meanings, and of course that makes the rose even more interesting, not less, doesn't it? Yeah, to think about it.
And you think about all the different ways that we use rose, just the actual word, like you're talking literally about getting out of the tube and slowing down and smelling the roses. I mean, I don't know if you guys have that expression in Great Britain, but we certainly have it here, and it's more of a life lesson than an actual literal lesson. Just hey, you need to slow down and smell the roses. And there must be 100 instances where we use a rose as some kind of, we already talked about rose tinted or rose colored glasses. It's everywhere around us.
No, yeah, you're right. I mean, the rose has an amazing capacity to draw us out in various ways, in positive ways. Because even when we talk about, say, the fact that the rose has thorns and therefore can cause pain, which is, I think, for me, is a very important point not to forget. You know, we can focus on the rose just as a pretty flower, a scented flower, but it's also this very thorny plant.
If the thorns haven't been bred out of them, though.
Well, yeah, that's right. A lot of new roses, and especially the ones you give to people, the cut roses, don't have thorns, or they had the thorns removed by hand.
Right.
And yeah, we can understand why. And of course, that's also very symbolic. The Christians, the Catholics, removed the thorns from the rose when they called the Virgin Mary the rose with no thorns.
Yeah.
Why did they do that? Well, because they couldn't accept the possibility of a symbol that had that ambiguity, that it had the strength, you know, the beauty and the pain, the violence and the beauty. The Virgin Mary had to just be one side of the binary. And that's Christianity as a whole. Devil, Satan, the bad guy, God, the good guy. So
yeah, and I bet you somewhere along the line, some old Levant guy got scratched by a rose bush, got infected, and he died from it. You know, and so it made it even more like we got to watch out for roses. You know, those things
that can happen. You know, that happened to me. I got infected by a rose scratch. Because it's not the rose that did it. It's just the rose opened the wound, and then the bacteria got inside from the soil or whatever. Well, if you work, but it can happen. It can happen.
It can happen.
So but anyway, it just, you know, why the rose has thorns to say back off.
Right.
It's saying back off, but also it's saying come here. So wow, interesting, isn't it? You know, these two signals coming from the same place.
Well, I appreciate you coming here and giving us a signal all the way from Korea. That's fantastic. And I just think it's neat. Everybody should get, by any other name, a cultural history of the rose, and look, it's such a neat thing, and it goes back to ancient times, and what else do you need, you know? And our guest is Simon Morley, of course. You go to Amazon, get all his stuff. What else do you want to say in closing, Simon?
Well, not much, just that I'm very pleased that I in Korea right now, I'm helping to create a peace rose garden on the DMZ. The DMZ is the line between North and South Korea, right? And actually I live near there. And we're creating a DMZ, a World Peace Rose Garden, to celebrate, partly the Korean War and the UN forces who participated, but also the North Koreans and the Chinese, or everybody will be, and also the dream of peace in the world, because that's one of the new symbolic meanings of the roses. It's a symbol of peace.
Well, we can use more of that.
Yeah.
All right, stand by. Let me shut this thing down.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much